The lost city of Atlantis. Where is it? Modern archaeologists have guesses that range everywhere from the Azores to southern Spain to the North Sea. But nobody's found it yet. Or have we? Welcome to the in-between. I'm Carol Ann. If you haven't already seen our Atlantis overview video, there's a link in the description below. But today, we're bringing you something different. Because Atlantis, well, it may have been found. A group of ancient explorers, more than happy to take on a small exploration expedition before they have to get back on their boat again, choose the obvious path in front of them, a wide, flat plain seemingly carved out from the higher plains rising on each side. As they trek on, their feet continually crunching on seashells, they see remnants of a civilization at numerous spots along their journey in the form of rock drawings. The drawings show tools and weapons and boats and even chariots. Lots of chariots. As they walk even further, they see what's now known as Ben Amira, a huge monolithic rock standing alone in the flat, sandy plain. They climb the rock to get a better look at the surrounding landscape. Off in the distance, they see yet another small rise. So they climb down the rock and head over to the next rise, the Adrar Plateau. And after some time walking along the ridge, they see it. Laid out before them are the remnants of a huge abandoned city that to our explorers had to have been a place of great power and wonder and riches. This must have been the home to all of the boats and weapons and chariots that they saw drawn on the rocks they'd passed on the way here. This must have been Atlantis. Who made this incredible discovery? Well, we don't know. We know someone did, but we have several candidates. And to understand the potential of this location, we have to backtrack a little so we can get the whole story in the proper context. So let's go back, and get a look at the first literal picture, the maps. Now, there's a few things we need to understand about what people thought the world was when they made the first maps. At first, there were just two islands, Europe and Asia. Back then, people only knew that there were two types of land. One was green and cold, that was Europe, and the other was hot, that was Asia. But then they're like, well, wait a minute, all of Asia is hot, but there's kind of a difference between the East and the West. Notice I said they were islands. That's because back then, anytime you needed to cross any amount of water to get to the other land, that land was considered an island, or in Greek, Nessos. It didn't have to be surrounded by water. You just had to cross some body of water to get there, even a river. So they noticed that the Nile River actually broke up Asia into two islands. So they named the new island Libya. Up to that point, nobody had ventured very far into Libya, so that's where the map stops. So now there are three islands. Another important thing to keep in mind is that the Okeanos, or the ocean, was like the ocean. It was the huge body of water that was thought to be more like a huge river that surrounded everything, and the land was a big circle in the middle of it. So all lakes and rivers come from the Okeanos. And that means that when you hear that the location of Atlantis was past the Atlantic Sea, it does not mean the Atlantic Ocean. Their use of the term sea could just as easily mean a lake. But our first stop goes back even further than these maps. We're going to start out way back, like 20,000 years back. At that time, there was a tribe of people living in the mountain country just a bit inland from the north coast of Africa. Now, science referred to them as Ibero-Maurusians, but in ancient times, they were known as Atlanteans. In fact, the mountain range that they were known to inhabit is, to this day, known as the Atlas Mountains. And that whole area, basically anything that wasn't the area that is now Egypt and Libya, was known as Atlantia or Atlantis, the kingdom of the descendants of Atlas, also known as the Atlanteans. For reasons not quite clear, those mountain-dwelling Atlanteans started moving east around 8700 BC. Took them about 700 years, but they managed to make their way all the way across the northern coast of Africa until they got to Egypt. Most historians will tell you that the first civilizations in Egypt started around 3100 BC, but that's not quite true. There were several tribes in the area way before that. But when the Atlanteans arrive, they come face to face with probably either the Khadans or the Harifians. Whoever it was not a happy encounter for the current inhabitants. Probably one of the first wars in human history. The Atlanteans were a different breed of human, so to speak, with noticeably bigger and different skulls. And they were said to be advanced people, which probably means that they had advanced weaponry. All we really know is that both of these cultures, the Harifians and the Khadans, both died out around that same time that the Atlanteans hit the scene. And how do we know this? Well, both archaeological evidence and because those who lived kept records. But hold that thought for a bit because our timeline takes a bit of a jump right here. Fast forward to 600 BC, and King Necho II, king of Egypt, was a little ticked off, and he's been that way for 5 years. Because 5 years before that, he and his army were trounced by King Nebuchadnezzar II and his Babylonian army, causing Necho II to lose all of his lands east of the Red Sea. Not so good for the ego. So he's just itching to find some place that he can conquer to make up for it. So he has two choices, south or west. Now, he pretty much knew what to expect if he went south, but he has no idea what lays to the west. So before sending his armies in that direction, he decides a little reconnaissance mission might be in order. Let's figure out A, if there's anything worth conquering, and or B, if we attack, can we win? And instead of sending his own people, he manages to talk some Phoenicians who are great sailors into sailing around Libya, or Africa as we know it today, and checking out that west side to see if there's anything worth sending an army for. Now remember, they didn't think there was too much beyond what they already knew to be out there. So they didn't think that sailing around to the west side of the island from the south would really take that long. In fact, what he really wanted them to find was a river that would give them a shortcut to the west side without having to go around the entire island. And since they didn't have the huge galleon ships like the explorers of the 16th century had that could hold a lot of supplies, the Phoenicians would sail for a while, stop, plant seeds, and while they're waiting for harvest time, have a look around and explore wherever they are at the time. Pretty unique way to explore. Once they can harvest what they've planted, they load up the ships and head on down the coast, which means it took them 3 years to get it all the way around. And one of the last stops they made before sailing their way back east through the Strait of Gibraltar and back home was the Bay of Arguin. Could these have been the guys who walked up the dry riverbed? They absolutely could have been. Once they stop and plant their seeds, they have months to look around and explore the region before it's harvest time. Did they? I'm not sure we'll ever know for sure, but we do know that after that trip, the maps were updated to include a fourth island continent of Atlantia. And just a few years after the Phoenician explorers sail home, a guy named Solon takes a trip from Athens to Egypt. Solon is well known as one of the 7 wise men of Greece, and he's actually credited as the man who laid the foundations for democracy in Greece. I love this guy. Athens was having issues under their current system, so they hand over the power to reform their laws to Solon. Then Solon makes a bunch of changes, and being a man of true integrity, hands the power back to the people. He then takes off, traveling for 10 years so that no one can persuade him to change the new laws back. And one of the places that he visits is Egypt. By this time, civilization in Egypt is pretty well established. Solon spends some time hanging out with the current pharaoh of Egypt at the time, Amasis II, and learning and debating with some of the priests in their temples. He's chatting with the priest at the temple of Sais one day about the long, storied past of Greece, dating all the way back to 1500 BC. When the priest says to him,
"O Solon, you Hellenes are never anything but children, and there is not an old man among you."
Solon asks him, "What do you mean?"
"I mean to say that in mind, you are all young. There is no old opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age. And I will tell you why."
So the priest explains to Solon that the Grecians can only go back in their history to 1500 BC for a good reason. Because right around then, the volcano on the island of Thera, or modern-day Santorini, erupted. And I mean erupted. On the Volcanic Explosivity Index, Mount St. Helens was about a 4.5. This was between a 6 and a 7, and the scale only goes up to 7. So it pretty much wipes out the island of Crete and sends a 30-foot tsunami through the Mediterranean and Aegean seas, taking a lot of people and Greek history with it. The priest goes on to explain by literally reading the writing on the walls, as the walls of the temple are covered in hieroglyphics documenting their history, that the world has had countless deluges and earthquakes, and many civilizations have come and gone. Unfortunately, we can't look at those walls today because the temple at Sais was claimed by the Nile River.
They sank into the swamp. So
he then gives Solon a quick rundown on their much longer history, including the battle with the Atlantean people who defeated Egypt in that time and colonized the area. Many of the Atlanteans settled there and told stories of their past and of their once great capital city, Atlantis, which was destroyed in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, reclaimed by the sea and leaving only an impassable, muddy plain with just a few reeds reaching out of the water. Eventually, Solon returns home and tells everyone about his 10 years of adventure, including his conversation with the Egyptian priest. Over time and oral tradition, the story eventually makes its way to Plato. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. A few years after Solon's visit to Egypt, Hanno the explorer from Carthage decides to sow some exploration oats. So he sets out to explore from Carthage in the Mediterranean down the western side of the island. He wrote all about his trip in the Periplus of Hanno. A periplus is basically just an ancient journal explorers used to keep track of navigation and discoveries and any people they ran into, and even future trading opportunities that they might have. So they sail past the Strait of Gibraltar and down the coastline. One of their first stops is at the Lixus River, which is now the Leucos River, located at the modern city of Larache. They met the Lexitas people and hang out with them for a while. The Lexitas tell Hanno of these men who lived above them in the mountains,
dwelling in a land full of wild beasts and shut off by great mountains, from which they say the Lixus flows, and on the mountains live men of various shapes, cave dwellers, who, so the Lixitas say, are fleeter of foot than horses.
So that tells us that as of roughly 500 BC, there are still some people living up in the Atlas Mountains that didn't look like the rest of the people around them. Sometime in the following 100 years, a Greek historian called Hellanicus writes his version of world history that includes a mention of Atlantis, as does Diodorus Siculus in his Library of history around roughly 50 BC. And right in between those two guys, around 360 BC, we get the books known as Critias and Timaeus from none other than Plato, whose description of Atlantis passed down through oral tradition, through multiple generations, starting from his ancestor Solon, who got it straight from the Egyptian priest, is by far the most famous. According to Plato's account, Atlantis was a large island located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, or the Strait of Gibraltar. It was ruled by a powerful kingdom with an advanced civilization and technology. The Atlanteans lived in a utopian society with magnificent palaces, temples, and infrastructure. However, Plato described how the Atlanteans became greedy and imperialistic. About 9,000 years before Solon's time, they conquered and enslaved much of Africa. They were eventually defeated by the Aegeans, who were the ancient ancestors of the Athenians, in a great war. But even though the Atlanteans lost the war, the gods are still displeased by their hubris and corruption. So in a single cataclysmic day and night, Atlantis is destroyed by earthquakes, floods, and is swallowed up by the sea, lost beneath the waters. Only an impassable muddy shoal remains where the great city once stood. Now, most of us have heard at least this rough description of Atlantis from Plato before, but many don't believe it because they say the whole story is just a made-up tale, an allegory to teach the consequences of bad government on top of bad morals. However, throughout all the rest of Plato's works, he actually goes through the trouble of pointing out which ones are stories or allegories, fictitious narratives to prove a point. But he does not do that for either Critias or Timaeus. In fact, he goes out of his way in numerous points to say that Atlantis was a real place and that this is real history passed on from his ancestor, the great Solon. If these were indeed fables, why would he go out of his way to say otherwise, not call them out like all the others? And while we're in the depths of ancient Greek philosophers, let's dispel another common myth, the mistaken idea that Aristotle said the quiet part out loud, that Atlantis was a fictional creation of Plato. He actually said no such thing. In fact, up until the 19th century, no one had the idea that Aristotle didn't believe that Atlantis was real. Not until a French astronomer named Jean-Baptiste Joseph Delambre made a grave error in the early 1800s. See if you can track with me on this. In reading a commentary work written in Latin in 1587 by a French scholar named Isaac Casaubon, which was about the work of Greek geographer Strabo, written around the year 0, which was talking about a comment made by a Greek historian, Posidonius, written about 50 BC, that mentions Atlantis, he made a mistake in his translation, which ended up tying together two completely unrelated passages. I couldn't make that up if I tried. That whole story is a video for another channel, but suffice to say that ever since then, people have taken it as gospel that Aristotle didn't believe Atlantis was real. But he did. So if we proceed with the idea that Plato's story is a true telling of history, then let's take a closer look at exactly what he said, because as they say, the devil is in the details. Between both of his works, Critias and Timaeus, but especially Critias, Plato puts forth several details about the city of Atlantis.
Making alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water. And beginning from the sea they bored a canal, making a passage from the sea up to this, which became a harbour. And the stone they quarried beneath the central island all round, and from beneath the outer and inner circles, some of it being white, some black, and some red. Surrounding the city was a level plain, extending in one direction 3,000 stadia, but across the centre, inland, it was 2,000 stadia. This part of the island looked towards the south and was sheltered from the north. Rivers and lakes and meadows supplying food enough for every animal, wild or tame. The surrounding mountains were celebrated for their number and size and beauty, far beyond any which still exist.
At this point, I know some of you know exactly where we are going with this. But for those of you who don't, welcome to the Eye of the Sahara, also known as the Eye of Africa, or technically known as the Richat Structure. Now, a lot of this information comes from the work of Jimmy Corsetti at Bright Insight and Chris Tolworthy from Pythagoras Was Right. So big thank yous to both of them. Links to their channels and to their websites are in the description below. Definitely go check those out. So, what is the Richat Structure? The Richat Structure is a roughly 100 million year old geological rock formation, presumably the remnants of a collapsed volcanic dome, smack dab in the middle of the Sahara Desert in what is now the country of Mauritania. I know, seems like an odd location for Atlantis, but this place ticks a ton of Atlantean detail boxes. It didn't get any attention from modern geologists until about the 1930s and 40s. And because of how big it is from side to side, we didn't get our first really good look at the whole of the structure until satellite imagery taken in the 1960s. And I know it doesn't really look like much today, but imagine what it may have been like, let's say 20,000 years ago. 100 million years of geological machinations would have built up the soil on top of the structure. And I do mean soil. There's plenty of evidence of this area alternating between lush and green and the desert that it is today. So there's plenty of organic material for soil back then. The other thing we need to keep in mind is that Africa used to have a vast network of lakes and rivers, which would have made any migration or expansion pretty easy. We now know there was once a huge river in this very same area called the Tamanrasset that was flowing up until about 5,000 years ago, the same time that the whole area dried up. It was big, so it would have had tributaries coming from all over. There was also Mega Lake Chad that connected surrounding area rivers. So, with all of this water flowing in seemingly every direction, to think that there could have been a river system that connected the Richat to the ocean is not crazy at all. In fact, many people of the era thought that the Nile curved west and came out on the other side of the island. That's what Nico II sent the Phoenicians to find. That dissecting river stays on maps for a long time. We know now that it's not quite how things are laid out, but it does go to show that Africa once had long rivers that went deep into the interior of the continent. So let's say that you're a wandering Atlantean and you're crossing this flat area that is now known as the Adrar Plateau, which translates to Little Atlas. And you make it to the other side, only to look out and see some lush, green, hilly territory with valleys filled with water from connected streams and rivers, all laid out right in front of you. And once you explore the area a little more, you realize that those hills and valleys form circles. What a great place to build a fortified city. Seems like a no-brainer. People have been taking advantage of pre-existing geologic structures since the beginning of time. Okay, so now we have a civilization living on the structure. How on earth do we connect that to Plato's description of Atlantis? Well, let's go through what he said. Plato mentions that the full diameter of Atlantis is 127 stadia. One stadia is 607 feet. So 127 stadia equals 77,089 feet, or about 14 and a half miles, or about 23 kilometers. Now, I get that my Google Earth measurements aren't that exact, but this is pretty darn close. He mentions mountains to the north that had rivers flowing down. He mentions a wide plain. The rings are there. The opening to the south for ships coming in and out is there. The red, white, and black stones are all over the place. Okay, let's tackle the idea that Atlantis was an island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The name certainly tells us that we're heading in the right direction. So if you're leaving from Greece, you first need to sail across the Mediterranean Sea to the place where the sea meets the Atlantic. That place is the Strait of Gibraltar. Plato said,
"There was an island situated in front of the straits, which are by you called the Pillars of Heracles."
Now, the Pillars of Heracles are the Greek version of the Pillars of Hercules. Same thing. They're both just names of the two mountains on either side of the Strait of Gibraltar, where it's claimed that Hercules used his might to push the African and European continents apart between the two mountains. But what does he mean by in front of the straits? Well, back then, that huge expanse in front of you that is the Atlantic Ocean was nothing but certain death. So they just didn't go out there. Instead, they always stuck close to whatever coastline they were sailing. So when you look at the strait, the path in front of you would be the northern coastal Sea of Africa, which was called Atlanticum Mare, or the Sea of Atlas. Therefore, the path to Atlantis was along the coast of Africa and past the Atlas Mountains. Once you get out past the strait, the Gulf and Canary currents pick you right up and pull you along the coast of Africa, which eventually leads you down to the Bay of Arguin, the closest open water spot to the Richat Structure. One more reason that Atlantis is most likely not an island as we imagine, out in the middle of the ocean, is that Plato said,
"Harbors were full of vessels and merchants coming from all parts, night and day."
Well, that implies a central location, not the middle of an ocean. There were not hundreds of ships sailing into the middle of the ocean on a regular basis to trade. It's just not how it worked back then. Which means it also has to be a place big enough for a large population if it's busy all day and all night. And for those of you keeping track of other possible locations, that rules out the Azores. And I know it's hard to wrap your head around the idea that an island could be in the middle of a continent. But again, back then, island just meant a place that you had to cross water to get to. The type and size of the water didn't matter. River, lake, it all meant the same thing. And in those days, there were lots of rivers flowing that could have been in the path of people traveling over from east to west. Literally, whole continents were referred to as islands. And I have to take one last shot at the island in the middle of the ocean theory. Elephants. Plato said,
"There were a great number of elephants in the island."
Here's the Siren's vase from 5th century BC, depicting the type of boats that they had then. Now, by the time they got to Plato in the 4th century, they had something called a trireme, which is much bigger. But even then, I still can't imagine boats from 8,000 years before that were anywhere near big enough to hold an elephant for an extended amount of time while they sailed the Atlantic Ocean. The area around the Eye of the Sahara, on the other hand, is full of rock art depictions of elephants. Elephant bones are still around, and elephants still live all over southwestern and southern Africa. So there's no reason to think that they wouldn't have been in the northern regions back when it was lush and green 5,000 to 8,000 years ago. Another feature of Atlantis was its abundance of gold. Plato describes statues of gold, gold throughout the temples, and walls of gold around that. Gold everywhere. Wow. Ancient Mauritania, which includes the Richat Structure, was known for having lots of gold. They're the ones who supplied Europe with gold before the discovery of America. The Mali Empire king Mansa Musa, who ruled a region including Mauritania in the 14th century, was the richest man in history, owning more than half the world's gold. And what is one of Mauritania's main industries and exports today? Gold. One of the rings of land, Plato says,
a race course of a stadium in width and in length allowed to extend all round the island for horses to race in.
Sounds kind of funny to think of horse races before 9000 BC, but around that whole area, there are over 1,200 different locations of rock art depicting chariots. Lots and lots of chariots. Not to mention weapons and shields and a whole lot of boats. Plato also mentioned that Egypt was a colony of Atlantis. And since we know those Atlanteans, or Ibero-Maurusians, came out of the Atlas Mountains and moved east until they clashed with and defeated either the Khadans or the Harifians, whichever one was there at the time. So making that area a colony after that is totally plausible. And our last reference, for now, to Plato's Critias talks about what happened after whatever happened to Atlantis. Plato says it
became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to any part of the sea.
Now, as far as I'm concerned, we can take this in two different ways. First, if there was a huge flood of some kind that wiped out the city, that whole level plain would, for a time, become a big mud plain. Can't sail down any rivers in that. Or if that flood wiped the city out to the sea to the west and dumped all of the debris when it reached the ocean, there should be a mud pit there. And there is. If there was a deluge of water from whatever source, based on the current topography of Africa, the water would have drained to the west. And we can see on old maps the existence of a mud shoal. And considering when they sailed at the time they hugged the coast, that might seem like an impassable barrier of mud. And I also just want to talk a little bit about the idea that the Atlanteans were a technologically advanced civilization. Plato doesn't go into detail about that, but based on his writing, that is something that has been inferred. And we in these modern times have often interpreted that to mean that they must have had crystal energy and advanced construction and transportation. But that's our idea, not what's written. Sure, they were super rich, militarily strong, and seemingly wise beyond their peers, but to be an advanced civilization only really takes being a little bit more advanced than the next guy. Now, is the only historical evidence we have for the existence of Atlanteans and of the Eye of the Sahara being a possible hub of activity only from written accounts and stories? Nope. We have plenty of ancient maps that show us as well. Let's go all the way back to Herodotus. Remember him, father of history? Maps made from his writings of what the world looked like then clearly show the Atlantis region or kingdom. Now keep in mind that Atlantis was known to be the capital city of the Atlantis or Atlantes kingdom. Kind of like New York City in the state of New York.
New York City!
We also have the map drawn up by Pomponius Mela in roughly 40 AD called the Habitable World of Pomponius Mela. That also shows an area of the western portion of the Sahara as the area of the Atlante, in the same geographical area where the Richat Structure sits. We also have numerous maps that show a region right around where the Richat would be as a big body of water connected to either the oceans or other great rivers, which would make them a trade hub. Side note, I want to know what this guy is all about. Or maybe I don't. On top of that, we have maps that seem to actually show the structure. This map from 1743 was created by European slave traders marking the spots in Africa where they can get more slaves. It's known as the Karagoli map because of its mention of a particular village right around where the Richat is located called Karagoli Mororum Pagus. That's Latin for Karagoli Moorish village. Moorish just means from Mauritania. Karagoli is Latin for spiral shape. Okay, so let's step back for a second and go over what we have so far. We have a naturally occurring structure that makes a perfect fortified city with water and rivers. We have ancient maps placing a group of people living in the area who most likely stumbled upon it at some point. We have anthropologic proof that these people migrated east and met up with the people in early Egypt and subjugated them. We have the stories of those settlers of their past written out in hieroglyphics. We have people from another area bringing those stories back home and writing them down. We have one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived making those stories public through his wide educational reach. And we have independent evidence that corroborates both the details of the story and the overall context in which the story was written. Okay, so what is the Richat structure? The ultra short version is it's a 100 million year old collapsed volcanic dome that left nearly perfect concentric rings when it popped. Now, there are some that say that it isn't a volcanic dome, that it came from a gigantic plasma strike from another giant celestial body coming very close to Earth, close enough to electrically connect. But no matter how it formed, and now it sits in the middle of the Sahara Desert, about 300 miles from the western coastline of Africa, in what is now the country of Mauritania. French geologists Theodore Monod and Richard Mollard studied the area in the 1940s and 1950s, but it wasn't until the 1965 Gemini 4 space mission that we got our first good overhead look at the structure. And testing done in the 60s on the rocks that compose the structure found no evidence of the kind of change in the rock that is only created by sudden heat and high pressure. So it's not an impact crater. It is highly eroded, but interestingly, the Wikipedia page that talks about it doesn't give any opinion as to what those erosion forces might have been. But then again, 100 million years is a long time to be sitting there baking in the sun. The number of changes that area has been through in that time is pretty staggering. I mean, the entire western chunk even separated for a while with what is called the Trans-Saharan Seaway sometime between 150 million years ago, so after the Richat structure was born. And the whole desert itself has gone from a desert environment to hot, humid, lush, and green numerous times over millennia. This current dry stage is only roughly 5,000 years old, a mere blink of the geologic eye. Before that, which would be when Atlantis is said to have existed and perished, it was mostly in the lush and green phase. It had water everywhere, with lots of lakes and even a couple mega lakes like Mega Lake Chad, which at its height was the biggest freshwater lake ever, bigger than all of the North American Great Lakes combined by an additional 50%. In fact, one of those mega lakes was Lake Tritonus that is rumored to have existed up in the northern area of Africa around Tunisia and or northern Algeria. Some scholars believe that this may have been the body of water that was needed to be crossed to get to Atlantis, giving Atlantis its status as an island. What does that have to do with the Richat structure? Not much. But as a Star Wars fan, I just wanted to point out that the area they think Lake Tritonus existed in is also the childhood home of one Luke Skywalker. There are all kinds of maps showing some of the lakes and even the larger rivers that used to flow over the dry sand. One of those larger rivers, or river networks, was the Tamanrasset. This thing was so big that it could pretty much connect anything in the upper Saharan area from the Atlas Mountains all the way down to south of the Richat. In fact, the system was so big that if it were still here today, it would rank 12th among the top 50 largest drainage basins worldwide. And it moved so much water that it created what is known today as the Cap Timiris Canyon, which is a 250-mile or 400-kilometer long submarine channel system that starts just past the Bay of Arguin. Now, to get all of that water together would have taken lots of feeder rivers. Is it possible that one of those feeders went next to the Richat? I wouldn't think that that's out of the question, especially when we can see evidence not far away of not only a lake, and a pretty big one at that, but also of what is possibly a man-made canal that would bring that water over to the eye side of the plateau. It certainly has the salt or mineral deposits that you would expect to see on the bottom of a dry lake bed. But if you look at the edges, the horizontal striations show that this was most likely a shoreline. And if we back out just a bit, we can see this line right across the middle. I have no idea what that is, but a straight line in the middle of a lake doesn't happen very often in nature. And here's a better look at that possible canal. Does that look natural? Or did someone dig this? We can see along the neighboring plateau ridge plenty of evidence of water moving across the land. And looking at the current topography, is it really a stretch to think that the riverbed here in yellow could have connected to the rings of the Richat? I don't think so. All it would take is one water source flowing down the plateau, which looks like there were many, to fill the rings with water and flow out the other side again. Then, something shifted in the grand scheme of global climate around 5,000 years ago that dried up the entire area into the vast desert we see today. But that warming is part of a regular cycle of dry and wet that the Sahara is now known to go through. The question we need to answer is, if the Richat Structure is the site of the city of Atlantis, how did it get destroyed? That is the million-dollar question. Well, if you believe that the Richat Structure is the lost city of Atlantis, then it obviously didn't sink to the bottom of the ocean. So how would the demise of inhabitants of an island structure happen in a way that would match Plato's description of,
"And in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth"?
how about a giant cataclysmic wall of water? Think that's not possible? Think again. Now, a lot of people talk a lot about something called the Younger Dryas as probably having something to do with whatever events happened to cause the flooding of Atlantis. The Younger Dryas was a period from approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, give or take a few years, when the Earth's temperatures dropped dramatically for 1,000 years. That part we know is a fact. What we don't know is why, and why the temperatures came roaring back at the end. Fun fact for today, the younger, older, and oldest Dryases are named for a flower. Dryas octopetala, better known as white dryads or mountain avens. These beautiful little white flowers love the cold, so thrive in cooler temperatures. So by measuring the amount of the pollen present in ice core samples, we can tell that the years with the high Dryas octopetala pollen counts were years of cooler temperatures. But the more I think about it, I'm starting to think that whatever happened to end the period of the Younger Dryas is coincidental to what happened to the city of Atlantis, even though the end of the Younger Dryas happened about the same time as the calamity at Atlantis. And let me just say right now that I'm not even pretending to have all the answers. I don't think it's possible that we ever will, but I know what I see. And what I see is water. Lots of water. Pictures of the area surrounding the Richat Structure and the Adrar Plateau from space show evidence of large-scale scouring of the surface. This scouring does not come from the wind. The windiest place on Earth is Cape Denison in Antarctica. And it's also nice and flat like the area around the Richat. But we see nothing like the scouring we see in Africa. Also, water is known to create ripples as it moves over sand. We know that Washington State had a massive flood event called the Missoula Flood because they still have those same ripples, only on a much bigger scale. And guess what? We see the same ripples in the sand at Mauritania. Now, some of you may jump on Google Earth, something I highly recommend, by the way. I can get lost in there for hours and take a closer look at Cape Denison. And if you scroll in, you will see some rippling happening in the snow. But, like I said last time, the devil is in the details. The ripples in Mauritania are readily visible at an altitude of 10 miles. The ripples in Cape Denison can only be seen at close range, 4,000 feet. If you zoom out to the same 10-mile altitude like we did in Africa, they disappear, showing only a white, flat plain, which, if you notice, is also devoid of the scour marks that we see in Africa as well. Clearly not the same geological forces at work here. Now, if you follow the work of the Oz Geology YouTube channel, who has done some awesome work on ancient tsunami detection, you will know that, according to him, the ripples are not the answer. The chevrons are. Chevrons are V-shaped areas of sediment deposits that a tsunami drops off as it loses strength as it goes inland. The good news? The Sahara has those as well. Lots of them, extending hundreds of miles in from the coast. But let's go back to scour marks for a moment. We also have that same scouring happening on the eastern side of the continent, where we can see Imikusi, a 1 million-year-old volcano and the highest point in the Sahara at 11,000 feet. Its last magma flow is dated to somewhere between 12 and 14,000 years ago. If we zoom out a bit, we can see the scour pattern actually flows around both sides of the volcano. And if we take a closer look, we can see the scour lines run over the top of the flow field. So they had to have happened after that flow 12 to 14,000 years ago. Now, we have to thank Jimmy Corsetti and his YouTube channel, Bright Insight, for a lot of this research. But at this point, I'm going to diverge from Jimmy's opinion on one point. He mentions the salt deposit inside the caldera of Imikusi as something that would have been deposited during this major saltwater event. But I gotta disagree with him on this one. Imikusi is 11,000 feet or 3.3 kilometers tall, and I just don't think the wave would have been that big. I think the salt deposits are more likely to be from water springing up from inside the caldera itself. And while I don't think the salt in Imikusi necessarily tells us anything, we have salt in plenty of other places that do. The Saharan region is known for its huge salt deposits, no doubt in part from that trans-Saharan seaway that cut the continent in two. But we are not looking at the deep deposits. We are looking at the stuff hanging out on the surface. Let's take another look at those same sand ripples we saw earlier. See the white areas in between? That's salt. And we can see more salt inside the ring structures of the Richat Structure as well. And the thickest salt deposits are in the lowest lying areas, like the places where water would settle as it's drying out. And speaking of salt, all of the surface wells in the area are full of salt water. Now, whether that is because huge amounts of seawater washed over the land and percolated down into the shallowest water tables, or it's another lingering effect of the enormous amount of seawater that used to flow through here, I don't know, but you have to dig down over 600 feet to get to fresh water. But according to the documentary Visiting Atlantis, which you can only watch exclusively on the Gaia Network, link below, there's one well in the center of the Richat Structure, and just like Plato said,
a well near the central Acropolis provided the city with fresh water.
it's a freshwater well. Another argument against this being the site of any civilization is the fact that there's no visible evidence of anything ever being there. But considering that the people in the region built their houses using rocks and mud, if a biblical amount of water came through, there would be nothing left to see, just rocks. Rocks that Plato said,
"And the stone they quarried beneath the central island all round, and from beneath the outer and inner circles, some of it being white, some black, and some red."
And those white, black, and red stones are everywhere. That's pretty much all there is as far as the eye can see. And just because we can't see anything in the pictures, doesn't mean it's not there. There's never been any effort to excavate the site. Now, seeing as though it's 14 miles or 25 kilometers across, that would be a daunting task. But from what I understand, digging there is actually not allowed. So there goes any chance of finding that evidence. That being said, there actually is something left over. The area is a treasure trove of artifacts that can't be tied to any known civilization at this point, including stone spheres that are cut with a high degree of precision, and weights that look like ones known to be used for fishing nets. Why would people need fishing net weights unless they are surrounded by water? Okay, question. So if there was this big wall of water that washed everything away, where's the debris? Answer: in the ocean. It's called the Mauritania Slide Complex, which is actually two huge areas just off the western edge of Africa, right out from the Bay of Arguin, where gigantic piles of mud and debris were deposited on either side of the Cap Timris Canyon, where all that water cut the huge channel. When did all of this mud collect there? About 11,000 years ago. And for those of you keeping score, that's right about when Plato said Atlantis was destroyed. Now, one problem with the tsunami theory is that the Richat structure is currently about 1,300 feet or over 400 meters above sea level. That's a mighty tall wave, but that's where it currently sits. That doesn't mean that's how high it was 11,000 years ago. And I hear you barking, big dog. Tectonic plates move super slow. I know, but we know that Antarctica is rising at a rate of 1.6 inches per year right now. And 1,300 feet divided by 11,700 years is only 1.3 inches per year. So Africa rising to that height in that time frame is certainly doable. But what if the tectonic plate didn't do a slow rise like Antarctica is doing, but it had a series of bigger jumps? Follow me here. We know that the African plate is subducting under the Eurasian plate. In fact, those two plates hitting is what created the outer edge of the Atlas Mountains on the north coast. So this subduction, when one plate is sliding under the other, also makes for an active volcanic and earthquake-prone area. It's one of the 4 most earthquake-prone regions in the world, and the people of Crete and Pompeii will tell you that the volcanoes are there in the neighborhood as well. And the creation of the structure itself, along with the Canary and Cape Verde Islands, shows there's plenty of magma rolling around under the surface that is capable of affecting the land above it. So with all of that plate activity, it's hard to predict what's going to happen. And just to give you an idea of what can happen, take a look at the Noto Peninsula in Japan. They were just hit with an earthquake on January 1st, 2024. Happy New Year to you, with a magnitude of 7.6. That little jostle they felt was enough to raise the land underneath them by 3.5 feet and push them to the west almost 4 feet in just a few minutes. There are now oceanfront condos that are 800 feet from the ocean. So the last question to answer is, where did all of this water come from? Well, I think that based on the marking left on the surface of the land, probably points to a flow of water moving from east to west, which would point to something huge happening in the Mediterranean Sea. Does the Mediterranean have enough water for that? Yup. The average depth of the Mediterranean Sea is about 5,000 feet, or 1,500 meters. So it's not as deep as the bigger oceans, which average about 12,000 feet, or 3,700 meters. But it does have its deep spots, like Calypso Deep in the Ionian Sea, which is just over 17,000 feet, or 5,200 meters deep. So that's a lot of water. And considering the 6-mile wide rock that hit the earth and killed the dinosaurs could have created a tsunami thousands of feet high, I don't think it's a stretch to say that a smaller meteor, say 2 miles across, could have potentially pushed a wall of water several hundred feet high over the surface of Africa. In fact, Oz Geology, who we talked about a little earlier in looking for the sediment chevrons, is looking at a possible impact crater right in the Mediterranean just to the southeast of Italy, which makes it right in line with the chevron deposits he found in northern Africa. So is this theory provable? No. We do have plenty of factual evidence, but a lot of it is circumstantial. And for the time being, at least, we're just gonna have to keep digging and connecting dots where we can until the day someone finds that one piece of irrefutable evidence that can tie everything else together. And I think if this actually is the historical Atlantis, the evidence is out there somewhere. We just gotta find it. For example, as I was falling down yet another Google Earth rabbit hole, I found this on the edge of the Richat Structure. What? Can I say with 100% certainty that this is man-made? No, I can't. In fact, I found spots on the other side of the structure that look pretty similar as far as collections of rocks that look like thin slate, for lack of a better term. But this looks way too organized to be natural. But I don't know. What do you guys think? I do think we need to have more boots on the ground and just off the coast, combing every inch of the area to look for signs of ancient civilization. Maybe they're there, and considering the enormous amount of land we're talking about, we just haven't stumbled across them yet. I had never even heard of this place until we were researching our Atlantis video a few weeks ago. So I'm pretty sure there are plenty of other people out there who are hearing about this for the first time too. And I think that sharing this information to those who are in the same boat can only be a good thing. The more awareness we bring to the Richat Structure as a possible site for the location of the ancient city of Atlantis, the more people we can get out there to start looking for that needle in the haystack we would need to find to put an end to the question once and for all. Big shout outs to Jimmy Corsetti, David Stig Hansen, and Oz Geology for their excellent research. Links to their channels are in the description below. Make sure you go and check them out. Be careful out there, and I will see you here again on The In-Between.